many restrictions and constraints because of the shortage of funds, and every director will ask a designer to give him the cheapest possible set, so make it something very symbolic or something like that. But to start with, actually, whether it is the Greek theatre, the Japanese theatre, or the Chinese opera, or the Indian theatre as such, it used to be basically a formalistic thing. You had a same kind of setup in which everything was earmarked, and the orchestra had to be at one place, the actors, on the stage, and then if there is a king, give him an elevated space, things like that. So this happened in most of the theatre. If you take the Greek theatre, which used to be normally in a huge amphitheatre, they used to act. But if you take the Shakespearean theatre, it used to be in a very smaller kind of a place. The theatre should be, that way the designing was not attended to, except perhaps the costumes. Even in the costumes, I feel, when you see, say, if you take a Shakespearean actor, the way he used to, dress up, it is the same. It never is authentic to the actual happening. So, for example, if you take Kathakali or Yakshagana or something like that, the costuming is the same. If you take Bharatnatyam or something, the costuming is the same. There may be a little color variations are there, or color symbolism is used, but it is all formalistic. And this is how it was in the European theatre also. And later on, they developed this whole idea of elaborate sets, painted backdrops, and in the operas of the West, you will find. And in a way, in our company theatres also, we started using similar kind of painted scenery, and it used to be very symmetrical, and the style would be almost the same. If there is a garden set, or if there is a palace set, or if there is some house set or something, it is the same house, the same garden, the same palace which is shown for every play that is done. So this is something very peculiar, actually. We never really designed that way, In the modern theatre, there has been a lot of experiments, and people have based on miniatures or or some of these, patkathas and things like that. From that they got inspired, and then they made the designs. So I always have felt that not much attention has been given to the designing of a modern stage, and or we at the most we went in for some kind of box sets. The box set is what it is all flats, and painted the canvas on a wooden frame or something like that. So the box set came in between, but it was never a satisfying approach. So I think designing needs to be looked at in a very different way. The cost restraints are always there, and so we really don't spend much money, and mostly the amateur theatre cannot afford at all. I mean, so they make do everything. And in the same way, the lighting also, previously the lights used to be just a lamp, for example, it might be an oil lamp which was used and which created some kind of odd shadows on the stage, and the places where they chose to enact, either in a temple courtyard or maybe sometimes in a field where the jatras are done or yakshagana is done. So there has been quite a limitation for a designer to think of something different, elaborate, using various techniques and things like that. Today we have a lot of lighting available, sophisticated lighting, and but very few can afford so many lights. There are very few theatres which are well equipped in lighting. The same thing happens with the sound. In the amphitheatre, invariably, if you take the Greek theatre, they never had any kind of amplification. They didn't have microphones in those days, in the early days. So the voice was always, made more unnatural. You have to, even the softest dialogue had to be shouted at, So that subtlety somehow was missing. And today in acoustically well-built theatres, perhaps this kind of a problem is to an extent solved, or they use a lot of body mics, which are not visible, and they're able to project the voice of an actor in a more realistic and a natural manner. So the same thing even in makeup, for example. Our makeup used to be stylized makeup, very elaborate, like the Yakshagana or in Kathakali. It is all kind of a formalistic approach. But the realistic theatre today, what is in demand is the realistic theatre, where as little makeup as possible should be used, and the exaggeration has to be reduced, and make it look natural and realistic. So this is what I feel in designing. That's why when I say not much attention is given to designing in theatre, because of all these kind of constraints. I have done a lot of designing in a more sometimes symbolic and sometimes realistic. in a number of plays, in the Gujarati theatre, in the Hindi theatre, and even in English theatre. I've done. I've tried various kinds of experiments, and I've also designed a few dance programs and ballets, which give you a lot of scope for designing. So if you go through my designs, then you will understand what all techniques are used. And so what should we do today? What kind of designing is required? How many designers are there in India, for example? There is Alkazi Saab is a very good designer, theatre designer. So, and he designed many plays, and also he did another experiment, was to take the theatre into some old forts and things like that, where he did some historical, mythological plays, and he used the theatrical ambience which was available within the construction of a fort. I mean, in Purana Kila or in Firozshah Kotla in Delhi and places like that. And so that is another kind of experimentation which took place, and I should give a lot of credit to Mr. Alkazi in using different acting areas, in a given structure. So that was one way, and when he went into an actual auditorium and then did plays also, he used these elements in some way or the other. And so this is perhaps one way of doing theatre and giving more attention to the realistic approach.
Have you ever designed any of Shama Appa's plays?
Shama has done very few productions, I think, and one of the very important production of hers was Mudra Rakshas. In Mudra Rakshas, I used a kind of a curtain in the middle, oblong, and it was like a kalamkari. The whole story of Chanakya was painted in the kalamkari style, and then you had the rest of the background with a newspaper, actual newspaper, flats put all around, and with the banner lines and things like that, because it's a highly political kind of play, and I use this technique.
So someone's asked, how did you visualize the set design for Kuri by Samudaya?
Kuri was a very, very simple thing, just a small platform and a mandap with bamboos and buntings. So because although Sarveshwar Dayal Saxena did not think about the Kuri as or Bakri as a character, but I made it into a character, and an actress played the Bakri, and then they tried to install a little temple for her, these people, and then try to fool the people and collect a lot of money from the villagers and things. So this was that small little platform was all that was there, and then 4 bamboos. A very simple set it was. And later on, the same platform is used for other scenes where the politician comes. He needs a kind of an elevated space to stand and give his lecture, or a guest of honor comes, and in the play in the end, and then so that one little platform was used. And when we did this play in a festival of street plays in Bhopal, I remember we put up just this little platform in the market area behind the masjid, and we did the play, and the people were just surrounded all around, and they sat and watched the play. So it was something like a theatre in the round. Very simple.
What was the most challenging play that you designed for IPTA?
There are so many. I think Caucasian Chalk Circle was one of my elaborate sets. The Bertolt Brecht's, how an elaborate opening, and slowly the stage becomes simpler and simpler, and ultimately it just becomes just a chair and on a kind of a palanquin, and Azdak is taken round on that stage. But in the beginning, the church and the governor's house, and they were all very elaborate, and we had a scroll in the middle at the back. But even my other set, which was very interesting, was the one which I did for a play called Rashomon. The Rashomon play, Akira Kurosawa's film, was shot in one piece of the forest, and it is throughout drizzling. So that effect, that grey kind of atmosphere which he created, I tried to do that in on the stage. And we opened the play, I think, in Prithvi in Bombay, and I used the height of the open space which is there, which goes right up to about 20 feet high, and I had this woodcutter, right on top. Bomi Kapadia played that role, and he comes down from there, and then he's a person who watches the whole thing that is happening. And that play, the structure of the play was very interesting. It is one killing takes place. A samurai was killed by a bandit, and then he has an affair with his samurai's wife. So, and the play repeats itself. It is 4 different versions are enacted on the stage from 4 different characters, and the audience becomes the judge, and they have to take a decision as to which one is the correct interpretation. It's a very interesting play, Rashomon.
Someone's asked, what are your thoughts on set designs that use heavy setup and a lot of technical elements that make the actors disappear? I think what they mean is that the set is the foreground and the actor somehow becomes secondary.
No, I give a lot of space for the actors and their movement. I don't crowd stage too much. But if you take the Smashana Kurukshetra, the play, which is anti-war, anti-battle play, you can see the entire chorus and it was one single set with just a cutout of a horse which has been stabbed and killed, and the rath is broken, and that was this kind of a symbol which I used in Smashana Kurukshetra. And after that, when people come for their dear ones who fought in the battle and why they fought in the battle, for whose sake, whether they did fought for the Pandavas or did they fight for the Kauravas. So I used very minimum kind of set, and a lot of space was given for the movement. And Hamsa Moili, she choreographed the whole thing, and we had a martial art expert also, Rajan, who did the martial art part, and it was very interesting. One of my really good designs, I must say.
What for you are the most important things to look at when designing sets and costumes?
Well, in India, you have to create sets with minimum expenses because nobody can afford elaborate settings like in the West. So you try techniques which are simple. Material that is used is very simple. You see, like in what is architecture? It is a use of new elements, which are used to build a house or a building or something. In the same fashion, even in theatre, you have to use many materials which have come. I mean, it can be paper. You can start with paper because that's the cheapest material available, and certain kind of plastics are used, certain canvases are used, and so it's a question of how, to give the effect of glass, for example. I've done that in the play Dragon, Schwartz Dragon, which is called Rakshas. I used a lot of stained glass effect on the stage. It was very interesting. But the stained glass was not real glass. It was just sheets of plastic painted with kind of colors. So, I used a lot of cellophane paper stuck in that. So the cellophane paper is also not an expensive material. So because the cost restraint is always there, so you have to minimize the expense on materials and make sets.
Speaking of architecture, someone has asked that you've designed auditoriums and you've also designed for proscenium and thrust. So what is the differences between designing for
in the proscenium stage? Normally it's a given frame, so within that frame everything should happen. You can't change it. But in a thrust-in stage, you have just a space and your audience is sitting almost on three sides of the stage. So you have to use a different technique so that all the people from different angles can watch the play and have the impact of it. So the designing for a proscenium theatre is very, very different because a lot of things are hidden, you know. But in the thrust-in stage, you can't hide things. That whole idea of creating that illusion is not there. So you will avoid creating illusions. Like in Western operas, the illusion becomes very important. Whereas in a Brechtian theatre, that illusion is broken. You know. So this is an approach, and thrust-in stage gives you a scope to do that. You don't have these illusions at all.
How difficult is it to manage the color of the set and costumes along with the light, and how do you think about that?
Well, you see, the thing is, when you light up a stage, you use certain colors also. So when you think of your costume, suppose you design something in a green color, and then you have some amber light coming on it. So that green and an amber, you know, when they mix, it becomes a little brownish. You have to imagine beforehand what kind of colors you're going to use in the lighting. So that scheme has to be worked out. It's not very easy, you know. Suppose you have a blue light and a yellow costume, then it becomes green. So you have to think about it before you design itself, and what kind of lighting, what kind of colors you're going to use in the light. If you're using a lot of colored light, then you have to design the costumes also accordingly. You have to take care, because the light changes the look of any color.
But what if you're not designing the lights yourself? Like, you design your own lights, but for other people, the costume designer might be a different person from the light designer.
Yeah, but he should sit with the lighting person and then talk to him about it. But his scheme of colors for the costumes and what kind of lighting should be done. So it is it's a question of coordinating between two different artists. One technician is a lighting man, the other one is a designing person. Sometimes, you know, the set design is done by somebody, the costumes is done by someone else, the makeup is done by someone else. So in theatre it happens that different people do different jobs, but then they have to sit together and work out to bring in certain kind of harmony.
Someone has asked if you have a favorite set designer, and who is that?
I have one of my very favorite set designer, an European designer, is Heinz Heckroth. He's a German who did no doubt a lot of films, and then and he is the chief designer in Frankfurt Theatre, the National Theatre in Frankfurt, and he did a lot of designing for films also. And this was early during the wartime. In the Second World War, he escaped the Nazis, went away to England, and then he worked with Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, were filmmakers, and they made a number of very interesting and very well designed films. And Red Shoes is one of his contributions to the ballet film. The entire ballet was designed very beautifully. It is based on a story by Hans Christian Andersen, The Red Shoes. And then there was a Matter of Life and Death, and Gone to Earth, and many other films which were made by these directors, which Heinz Eckroth designed. I have, in fact, when I went to Germany in 1961, I met him at the Frankfurt Theatre. He was my favorite designer, and I had an opportunity to meet him and talk to him, and saw some of his paintings and things like that.
If you were to give advice to young designers today, other than what you mentioned, budget constraints, what do you think they should really focus on? What advice would you give young designers today?
You see, when you think of design, everyone talks of authenticity. But I don't think authenticity is that important. Nothing is that authentic. You have to use a certain style, and you can be authentic to that style of thing. Suppose you take a miniature, which like in Darashiko, I used a miniature and did the whole thing again very portable and as less expensive as possible. I used just mats, chicks, out of which I created that feeling of the arches and the four kind of minarets, especially in the many of these structures, the Muslim structures, Islamic architecture, they are very symmetrical. And I used a little bit of a scenic painting at the back on a strip. So it is not authentic to the period and things like that, but it gives that atmosphere. It captures that atmosphere. So you have to think of innovations, how to do it, how to make it cheap by cost and then effective, So I think that the authenticity part of it should be to a certain style rather than to an actual era.
Okay, so that was the end of the session. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll end the session now.
Thank you.